Okay, good evening. My name is Gielie Hoffmann. I'm going to be the moderator for this panel discussion. It's presented by the South African National Youth Orchestra, and the focus is on tension and how to handle that in ensembles and in wider or broader circumstances in the musical industry. And I'm sure everybody will agree that it's very relevant. This is pre-recorded and it will be shown live later on the Facebook page of the South African National Youth Orchestra. And we would like to all thank Sophia Welts for making this happen during the 2020 COVID pandemic time. So it's I know none of these people, but they all seem very nice to me. So I can't wait to learn more from them. I'm going to introduce them to you. First off, I would like to introduce retired Justice Zak Yacoob, who was part of the South African Constitutional Court for many years, and is and before that he was an anti-apartheid activist and was part of the Durban 6 trial and the famous Delmas treason trial, and he had an amazing career as a justice in South Africa. And currently, as a side note, he is also the chair of the interim board of Cricket South Africa, which is going through lots of changes as we speak. But we won't prompt him too much on that at this stage. Welcome, retired Justice Zak Yacoob.
Hello, thank you very much.
It's great to have you with us, and I'm going to give you some opportunity a little bit later to speak, but you are in Durban right at this stage.
Yeah.
It's great to have you with us. Next up is Samson Diamond. Samson is currently the appointed leader of the Odeion String Quartet. He's an acclaimed violinist and as well as a lecturer at the University of the Free State, and also the concert master of the Free State Symphony Orchestra. So do we find you in Bloemfontein at this stage, Samson?
Right at this moment you do, and I'm delighted to be here rather than in other parts of the country at the moment.
Yeah, you're proudly representing Central South Africa at this stage. We are glad to have you.
Yeah.
It's always good to have someone from the Free State. And then we are very fortunate to have Christopher Bruerton, who's a baritone in the King's Singers. He's been a member since 2012. And Christopher, you are currently in London, in the UK.
I'm in the UK, exactly, yeah.
Okay, but you're originally from New Zealand?
Yeah, I'm a South Island boy from Christchurch in New Zealand. So
wow.
My beloved Crusaders, if you want to talk about rugby.
Well, this year we can't talk about sport at all. It seems like our recent memory about sport has been erased. We know nothing about who's winning or who's losing at this stage. It's quite interesting. But thanks for making time. I know you had a music video shoot as well with the King Singers today. So it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
And you're definitely the most formally dressed of us all.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
And we appreciate that as well. But we have summer in South Africa in the Southern Hemisphere at this stage. So no formal shirts for us. So tonight, as I said, we're gonna speak about tension and how important it is actually, and how to cope with that, and how to handle specific situations. But I thought it would be great to start the conversation off with by giving each of you an opportunity for a few minutes to just share your initial thoughts about the topic, share your point of view, give us some background, and it would be great to just get some original ideas already from you guys to understand what you feel about this before we dive into the specifics and get our hands dirty. Retired Justice Zak, is it okay if I start with you?
Okay, I don't mind. I suppose conflict is necessary as far as I'm concerned in all human activity. It could be a very positive thing, and it's normally generated from differences of opinion, differences of approach, different ways of doing things, clash of personalities, different interpretations of what people read and see, different interpretations of pieces of music to come close to what we are talking about. But really, conflict is everywhere. And at the one level, properly managed, conflict is very helpful because differences produce new ideas and new ideas give rise to development. I think of the human body quite often and how cells multiply and divide repeatedly and all the time. And it is in that sense that conflict is, in a sense, the essence of development. The problem is that conflict has to be managed like every good thing. It can't just be there and become totally uncontrollable and totally out of hand. And the trick is how much conflict to allow, how much conflict is important, because any life activity without any conflicting strains does not reflect life itself really. And I suppose in a way, it is the effort to achieve the same objective which gives us every opportunity to resolve conflict. So I would equate, for example, judging, where all the judges who sit in one case have the objective of producing a good, effective, valuable judgment, and all the people working in an ensemble have the objective of producing the best music. And they've got to put their best into it at one level or another, and ways have got to be found. And the only way to do it is to take each other very seriously, to take each other's opinions very seriously, to consider them very carefully, and to work them through in one way or another. But the management of conflict also requires discipline. So, for example, in a majority-minority situation, the majority have got to learn to accept the discipline, the minority rather, have got to learn to accept the discipline of the majority view. And if you're not dealing in a democratic setting, I suppose in a music setting, the director is the boss. And as far as I'm concerned, it is the director's duty to take all the conflicts into account. But there's also conflict outside the music scene. So people who play music and people who are judges and lawyers have lunches together and they interact with each other and so on. And their likes and dislikes would begin to develop. And in a sense, that is a little more difficult to manage and requires a lot more self-control on the part of the person concerned. So I'll stop there. Internal and external conflict, the way to sort it out is the same. Ensure that we want to achieve a similar objective. Conflict and discipline, as far as I'm concerned. And ultimately, you start with the notion that absent conflict, there is no life. You've got to think of conflict as something positive and creative and learn how to manage it.
Great, thanks very much for that, Judge. It's a great way to frame our discussion, I actually think, in a very positive way. I jotted down so many specifics already I want to dive into, but we're going to wait a few minutes before we do that. Samson, can you share some of your thoughts, maybe?
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. And just to echo what the judge was referring to, especially with good tension and how it can create a positive result. Now, you must remember, in music, in fact, music is a lot about tension and resolution, where the cadences suggest that they may be perfect, imperfect, and interrupted. And all of that is a matter of navigating through conflict. And, for me, as a leader of the only professional string quartet resident at university in South Africa, in some ways, it gives me an insightful vantage perspective on the intimate workings of a very perhaps precarious and a working environment of a string quartet where there's a lot of tension. where you would also expect that, with 4 people, and unfortunately in a string quartet, it doesn't work so well as being a democratic institution, as it were. You have 2 violins, which already, by just having 2 instruments that are the same, you have an element of conflict, and then matched with a viola and a cello. And arguably, the string quartets, when at their highest approach of standards, they really have a way of working alone and have this element of interdependency. And with that, when you work alone and together, it can actually cause conflict, because whatever you think is right, when you put it together with somebody else, it may not be. So the element of compromise is an everyday struggle when working with other people. When I was appointed here in Bloemfontein, I was actually asked by a local paper, what's it like working with 3 women? And I responded to say that I work with 3 musicians, and again, this is another way of just, we always have to find a way of being able to draw commonalities rather than differences in making music together. The American approach of playing music for string quartets has been that it's 4 individuals that come together to make music harmoniously. Whereas in a European sense, you have 4 musicians who make a unified sound. Now, I mean, that is a completely different ways of thinking of how people make music together. But I mean, you can also guess which approach my quartet has gone with, because, to highlight the differences and also working together. I grew up in Soweto. Second violinist in string quartet is from Durbanville. The viola player is from Pretoria. The cellist is from Stellenbosch. You could almost say that we are worlds apart. And then we also moved to Bloemfontein together. So that's literally moving to another country altogether. And we have to find a way where we are able to speak the same language and with the same desired aspiration. So in my position as the first violinist, naturally, I take charge of the rehearsals. So that already changes the dynamics of how to think of the hierarchy of leadership. And there is an element of leadership and democracy in a string quartet, and also the roles. If you think that you have a second violinist who just having 2 violins, and if you say second violin, the connotation of saying second, it just means to somebody else that they think they're second best. And there's a complexity that you will always have to deal with throughout the working relationship in a string quartet. And it's a really complex role because it's not necessarily that it's second, it plays a particular specific role. So that makes those dynamics really sort of fertile for conflict. And string quartets, again, spend a lot of time together, which is the makings of trying to generate music at the highest level possible. But that in itself means that you find 4 people working intimately for long periods of time, which again is fertile for a lot of conflict if it can be managed well. I remember in my position, I was told stories of my predecessors who would pray before a rehearsal, and it didn't help because they would fight after that. So I mean, we in this endeavor, I really find that if music comes first, then already we are starting to build something. But then we have to agree what music is.
Okay. I'm gonna stop you right there.
I stop there. Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Samson. And same as with the judge, valuable, very specific things that I definitely want to delve into a little bit later. Christopher, on your side?
Well, I echo what Mr. Yacoob and Samson say. conflict is necessary in order to get to an outcome that is considered, because having an opportunity to stress test any idea, no matter how good it might seem on the face of it, I think is important. And even if at the very end of that stress test, if you like, or opposition, if it's done in a positive manner, I think that it's good to know that you've covered all your bases, and that even if you choose to go down the same path, you've at least explored other alternatives. My experience of being in charge or having to follow has been mixed, because as someone who grew up in the cathedral choir world, where from the age of 10 until 25, I was a professional chorister. And so I was essentially just doing what I was told. And then when I was a teacher at a school, and it was called Burnside High School, I had the opportunity as the director of music to be the one calling the shots. And then finally, the role I find myself in now with the King Singers, there are 6 musical directors. Unlike a string quartet, or similar to a string quartet, we are trying to make a singular sound, if you like. There's 6 of us, but we're trying to leave our vocal ego off stage so that we become a sort of corporate, unified, homogenous sound. However, unlike a string quartet, we don't have a leader. We are all leaders. And so there's a really interesting dynamic there where you offer each other the opportunity to have an idea and to try it. And it's usually pretty obvious, I'd say, on any given day, depending on the acoustics and how people are feeling at what point in the tour or 3-week tour or whatever it is, that after trying 1, 2, maybe 3 different ideas, it's usually pretty obvious to the group which one to settle on. And at the very least, agreeing to disagree is still an agreement. And that's really important, that you can try things in rehearsal, but by the time you take the stage for the evening performance, you have to be all of one opinion. So I think it's important to be able to voice that you may not agree with what the group decided, but that you support the democratic nature of how you come about making a decision as a 6. So you only need 4 votes, or 3 and 1 abstains, and that usually gets things over the line. But yeah, it's a really interesting process when you try things. And I think the hardest thing is when you feel strongly that an idea won't work even before you've tried it. But in order for that person who suggested it to feel valued, it's important to try it. And you never know. You might surprise yourself. An idea that you categorically thought wouldn't work might work. Or if it doesn't work, as you suspected, it might not. That person has now gone through that process and understands why. And that's really important, to offer them the opportunity to go through that process. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey for me. I've been a professional chorister my whole life, but I've gone from being the person doing what they're told to being someone that sometimes gets an opportunity to suggest something and the group takes it on board. And it's a lovely feeling. But equally, we're just trying to do what's best for the group. And so there has to be an element of putting forward a suggestion, but not having too much expectation that it will necessarily be accepted by the group. Although I would say the way in which you proffer an idea has a direct sort of, what's the word? The way in which you put forward an idea, helps with how it's often taken. So having a think about how you suggest things and your language, especially, and body language and tone of voice, all of that does aid the process of other people feeling like it could have been an idea that they had suggested. And those ideas that everyone feels ownership of are often the best ones. So it's been an interesting journey for the past 8 years, where there's constant compromise. And that's been at times challenging, and at other times hugely rewarding. And as long as it remains respectful, it does help.
Christopher, something that, thanks for that. And yeah, I want to pick up on something that you said and maybe ask Judge Yacoob about it. But why do you think we are so uncomfortable, or we have so much discomfort when it comes to conflict and tension, that people shy away from that? And is that something that you have to take care of before you actually can achieve and perform at a high level, to become comfortable with with tension and conflict?
Well, I think in the music world, all musicians are notoriously bad at taking things personally, because often, certainly in the case of a singer, we are the instrument, and separating a musical objective point from a subjective thing is difficult. And I think we are all very strong-willed, and to get to the top in music, you have to be pretty one-eyed, and you have to be pretty driven and have pretty strong opinions. And when you match with other people that also have strong opinions, there is naturally a time when often there is a bit of a clash. And one of the joys of live music making is that it's always different. You know, there isn't one way to perform something. And so I think whenever you have strong-willed, educated, really interested people who are passionate about something, that passion can sometimes be misconstrued when people are objecting. They're not objecting to you as a person, they just may have a slight difference of opinion, and that's okay.
On that note, Judge Yacoob, you said in your introduction that the difference in approach or in opinion is so important, but only if it's well managed. If we can dive into some of the practical things a little bit, what would you say is important to manage conflict well, to get that right? If we embrace it and encourage it, it still needs to be managed. What would you say is a good way of managing it?
The first thing to do is to create opportunities, both controlled and uncontrolled, in which conflict can play themselves out.
Okay.
So that there are situations in which people are able to talk exactly as they want and say what they want to say and sort things out amongst each other without too much intervention from whoever is in control of the situation. So that it gives you an opportunity to observe and work out what the reason is for the conflict and how best it can be resolved. But that opportunity obviously must not last too long. And then the second step in the exercise would be to try and work out what the reason for a particular conflict is. If it's a reason which amounts to a difference in experience, it's handled one way. It's a difference around, and experience in Africa is a very complicated thing, because I notice we haven't talked about race yet.
Yeah.
And people who come from different race groups in South Africa are different, not necessarily because of their own race. I will not say that a black person is different from a white person. The problem is that your life experiences are so different that I'm really talking about a middle-class black person will be the same, more or less, as a middle-class white person, except that there be differences in ways of eating and what the values would be and so on. But we don't understand the difficulties that poverty creates, poverty, lack of an appropriate life creates in people. So you might have somebody playing music today who is 35 or 40, who didn't know what a lounge suite was or a bed was until he or she was 15. And it is extremely difficult with that level of experience to expect the same performance. So one needs to take into account people's backgrounds. One needs to accommodate them properly, and one needs to make sure that these things play themselves out. And people must begin to understand each other, and that's not a romantic understanding. It's a real understanding of what makes the other person really tick. And I have actually found in many situations that if people truly try to see what the other person is about, of course, if there's bad faith, it's a different issue. You can't do anything about that. And sometimes you get people in the musical sector, in the legal profession, and so on, who are just powerful and arrogant and too full of themselves. You get a few people like that, and that is very, very difficult to manage. On the other hand, in most cases, it's a difference of opinion, difference of approach, different emphasis, a different way of doing things. And the trick actually is to try and work out how much of that you allow to exist within the group as being good for the group, or how much of that you allow to exist within an orchestra or an ensemble because it will be very, very good for the performance. And when does it get too bad? And that borderline sometimes is extremely difficult. If you get too close to it, once you cross it, things get very, very difficult indeed. So the thing is to allow things and to make sure that you have a clear determination of how far and it can be allowed to go, when it's good and it's not good. And the final point I wanted to make in answer to this question is that these problems are not for intellectual solution. They involve more feeling, emotion, instinct, a kind of instinctive understanding, a sort of life understanding. Yeah. So to try and be logical about problems of that sort is to make a mistake, because in these cases, the problem is that most people would say that they are right. The truth of the matter is that nobody is ever right all the time. And once you start making that point, and once you enforce it to ensure that everybody begins to understand it, the question then becomes a different one, which is who is more right, or whose opinion is better today for what we're going to do. Because for what you're going to do tomorrow, someone else's opinion might be better. So you can't throw away people's opinions as worthless all the time, nor can you accept them as wonderful all the time for who they are. So those, I think, are the difficulties.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna stop you there because I want to ask Samson here in terms of his string quartet and maybe previous experiences as well, or where you are teaching. As the appointed leader, do you have those controlled or uncontrolled opportunities the judge spoke about, where people can voice their differences or what they are unsure about, or where they feel difference to maybe your opinion?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, it completely resonates with my work ethic, that the way I approach it is to try and get the best from people. The people need to feel that there is a sense of ownership, of accountability, that they have something to contribute to the ensemble. So, for example, I always like to highlight that when one musician in the quartet is not contributing, then it's a trio. Then it's not a string quartet anymore. And also then if it's two, then it's a duo until it becomes, just one person playing a solo. So it is incredibly important that to realize all our different roles in how they contribute to the bigger picture of music making. And I think the thing with dynamics of how you handle musicians is that you are dealing with emotional people, and musicians themselves trying to handle each other is almost like a disaster waiting to happen anyway, because everybody's emotional. You don't want the lead or the first violinist has to be incredibly sensitive when being perhaps receiving feedback or criticism about something, and you have to look at it that if you don't have the ethos of thinking that what you're doing is about music, you're creating music, it's not about you, then you will find that you are probably going to achieve something greater than yourself. But if everything that you take in is that it becomes a personal attack, then it makes the whole thing incredibly difficult. In my view, especially when you work with people on a day-to-day basis, in that sort of intimate space, you have to be able to read people. The emotional intelligence, as was referred to by the judge, is incredibly important. Because you won't always be able to get the same thing from everybody. And also just people have to be amiable, and nothing is fixed in stone. There has to be a standard, the minimum of where you start, but nothing can be set in stone because all of it is also depending on circumstances. So the problem about in the ensemble when it comes to personalities is that one person who might just say, "You said this yesterday," and that is just that to say, "Yes, but today is today, and I changed my mind." And so those kind of dynamics are incredibly difficult to work with. And moving away from a string quartet and going further to larger ensembles, is that the musicianship, in a sense, has a hierarchy. And that's why we have somebody waving their hands in front of 30 to 70 musicians in front of them. But nonetheless, with that hierarchy, it works really well because there's an element of trust. There are principles, there are rank and file, and so on. And then you also have the musical leader. Now, the trust is about musicianship, is about whoever's conducting or leading everyone else, that they have the best interest of the music at heart, of the composer's intentions or whatever it may be, that the music still comes first. Unfortunately, in circumstances where you work with diverse people, you will always find that other people's opinions need to be heard much more than others. And that makes it an incredibly difficult space where it's always never changing in the conflict. And I have found that, just to bring context in with my position, is that quartets are made harder simply because they don't have a sort of cushion of full-time employment. So where they work already, the intensity is that this is a make it or break it situation. And my training in the UK was such that it's a privilege to even get to play in a string quartet, because there's a famous joke that how do you become a millionaire playing a string quartet? And the answer is that you have to start off as a billionaire. So in reality, it really is just a labor of love. And I find that with my situation, where we have the comfort of or support from the university, the intensity of how I studied this art form somewhat reduced, simply because there is no real worry about how will the bills be handled at the end of the month. And that changes the element of conflict as well, that perhaps you become a little bit more amiable to be forgiving, to say, well, actually not on the standards, but to say, normally I would be transfixed on saying that this is how it would go, but how about we try it again and see how it goes.
Thanks for that, Samson. There's a word that I keep picking up, and the judge also referred to that, and that's trust, or in good faith. I want to add that to that. Christopher, in your experience, in terms of the King's Singers, but also before that, what do you think is important?
Before I forget,
you can talk.
If you allow me, please, just to make two comments on what the previous person said. The first thing is a comment which I found problematic, is it is about the music, it is not about you. I'm afraid I can't agree with that comment, because it is about music and about you. And in a sense, you've got to blend them both together, because it is about the humanity and the music. The second comment, which I have a slight problem with, and I'd like to hear you, although you said that emotional intelligence was a good thing and the right balance is right, you said almost in a critical way that musicians are emotional people. I don't know whether I got it wrong, but I think that having the right balance between emotion and intelligence is better. And I want to make the point that I would rather associate with people who have a little more emotion than to associate. I mean, I don't think you know how obnoxious people who rely only on their intellect with little emotion can be.
Yeah. I feel some tension in the room, and it's fantastic because now we're going to get to the magic we spoke about. So this was not orchestrated. I just want to say this was not orchestrated, but it's the uncontrolled opportunity to voice difference that that contributed now.
Well,
Samson, I want to offer you the right of reply.
Yeah.
Well,
And then I'm going to get to Christopher after that.
I'm happy to be on standby as a mediator.
Okay, perfect.
Well, thank you, Judge. You're absolutely right about the balance of absolutely joining the musicianship with the human. Perhaps I take it for granted because I expected that good musicianship would be that it is a reflection of the individual. However, the interesting thing about being involved in what I call a recitalist approach in recreating Western art music, playing the late Beethoven string quartets and so on, is that we actually end up not. It is not so much then about the musicians, but it is about how to interpret the score so close to the composer's intentions, and perhaps that is more closely to what I meant about not being about the individual, but about the music, meaning that if we are to be faithfully interpreting the score, as it were, is that we should try and get closer and closer to that meaning, and which has been the most perhaps enthralling part of music making for orchestras, because you will also find this whole unification within an orchestra where you see musicians, I mean, a group all the way to about 80 to 90 people, where not so often, but it really happens that you feel that there's a sense of individualism, but that there's this unified form of music making and from all these different individuals. And that's what I mean, that where the music comes through out of the individuals.
That makes sense to me. But yeah, I think the middle ground there is if somebody is comfortable and feels seen and feels respected and feels heard in an orchestra or in an ensemble, then the music can step forward and become the highest priority. But if that first part is not present and there, then of course the music wouldn't be great in the end, I assume, as a non-musician.
No, you're right, Gielie, but I just want to stress one point. That's where it's so tough about musicianship, where you, at the most part, you can be in the periphery of the music making, and it's about understanding your role in all of that. You can be expected to be, so for example, I'm going to come back to the string quartet analogy, that you have the first violinist that would have the melody most of the time. So by association, people just think that, oh, that becomes the sort of the star of the show. But the first violinist without the other three, it is absolutely nothing. So it is just such a pity that how, and you can even see it in the mass choir as well, that you won't hear every single person singing, but you know they add to the greater good. And so it's not about the individual in the end. It becomes a form of unified approach. And that I tend to think that that's what music is about.
Christopher, if I can expand on that a little bit, and you said, you know, you are 6 leaders in the end in the King's Singers. You not have only one leader. Do you have like stock taking at the end of a year or at the end of a project, or when you lead into a new thing where you ask yourselves, are we on the same page? Does everybody feel happy with what the direction we are taking? Is that like an ongoing conversation or something that you try to create purposefully?
It's something that we pick up at the beginning of every rehearsal. In a normal year, we'd be performing around about 120 concerts. So there's about 120 rehearsals. And that ability to have an almost daily check-in with each other is really helpful for us. One thing that we have tried to do a bit more in the last 18 months especially is have an actual check-in at beginnings of meetings or on certain days, or whenever someone feels like it's a good time for us to stand in a circle and we ask each other a few questions, one of which might be, how are you feeling? Another might be, what sort of interference have you got going on? That might be something in your personal life. And maybe something like, what are you seeking to gain from this rehearsal or this meeting or something? And to which we each have about a minute to answer those pretty briefly and succinctly, but honestly. And you might say something like, oh, I'm feeling pretty good today. Bit of interference. I'm having a bit of trouble with something at home. But today I'm really hoping that we have clarity on which direction we want to go with this piece. And then the response from everyone is merely, thank you. And what that does is after about 6 minutes, what you have is a really clear picture of where everyone is emotionally on that given day. Because one thing that often happens, I know from experience, you might suggest something or say, well, what do you think about that? And someone might respond in a way that you hadn't foreseen. And they might slightly flip and you'll be thinking, well, what have I just said? And actually you might be totally unaware that there's something else going on in their personal life that totally affects how they are. If you knew that, not every single detail of someone's personal life, but if you just knew that things were a bit tricky, you might think how you phrase a question, and you might consider not suggesting certain things on that particular day. And I think having an awareness of where people are emotionally on any given day is super helpful. And that's been a transformative thing for us as an ensemble over the past 18 months, as we have sought to understand where each other's at emotionally on an almost daily basis. And because the response is thank you and not problem solving or is anything I can do, you can just air how you're feeling and just let it sit there. And it's really helpful. And then there's also like a checkout at the other end, which can be just as brief. And you might say something like, hey, I'm feeling really excited for tonight's performance. Just so you know, I'm a bit disappointed that we decided to go down a different route, but know that once we come on stage, I'm with you. And I think that's also important, to be able to voice dissatisfaction, but in a respectful manner. And I think what the judge was talking about earlier about a controlled or uncontrolled environment, for us, the rehearsal is very controlled in the sense that it has a start and a finish point, and that is the time where you talk openly. The uncontrolled bits are the times when you're traveling mid transfer somewhere, and you might suggest something, and that might be a good time to have certain conversations. And when we're also not afraid to have a courageous conversation where we can be pretty honest with someone about something that they may have said that might have upset us, and then you can move on, and it's dealt with quickly and pretty informally. Doesn't need to be a big sit down heart to heart. It can just be just a conversation, and that's different from professional feedback, where you give more clarity about specific things, which are perhaps less emotional but more objective. And I think that is an important distinction.
But how do you ensure that the weaker personalities in the group don't get subsumed by the stronger ones? Do you pay particular attention to those who are quiet, or what they say and how they behave or something? how would you manage that problem?
That's a very good question. We were talking about that recently, in fact. Another little catchphrase that we talk about is this idea of having a hot button, i.e. something that when pressed, you have a sort of an irrational response to, and you just, it might be that you get pretty hot-headed, it might be that you retreat into yourself, and it could be all sorts of things. We all know that there are certain moments that we might lose it. And I think it's important to be aware of what those triggers might be for individuals. And so we've talked about those, and we have them written down so that we have a better idea of what people might be triggered by, and what response is best. And one of the things is that some people get quite quiet. And what we've found is that, yes, we need to be encouraging to those people that traditionally may not be the first to proffer an opinion. So that's something that I think comes from experience, because naturally people that are passionate about a certain musical genre will often be very forthcoming with opinions. And I think those people are the ones that need to sit back sometimes and allow others to be the first to come up with an idea. And I think that's just about awareness. It's both self-awareness as well, and just as an awareness of the group at large. But yes, it's a very good point. And certainly when I was a choir director, I knew that if I asked a question to the group, there'd be certain people that would often be the first to put their hands up. And so sometimes I would specifically target the people that I knew would never raise their voice in a group situation. And I would ask them specifically for what they thought. And I think that's important if you are a leader, to be aware of that, be aware of the personalities, and to not discourage the people that are very vocal, but more to focus on encouraging those that aren't. And I think it's a balance, as we've talked about, but and we won't always get it right. And the ability to reflect and say, perhaps next time I need to just make sure I ask so-and-so what they think. Something I often did was I would ask my singers to come out and stand with me. And I would ask them, I'd ask the choir to sing again, and then I would ask them specifically, what do you hear? Because a big thing for me was to try and make my singers active listeners, not just passive, because it's very easy when you're in an organization where someone else is the chair or what have you, to just sit there and quietly mind your own business until you're asked to do something. And what I really wanted them to is to hear what I hear, so that they can almost self-police things, that they can hear when things aren't right, and they can make those changes themselves, rather than always just waiting to be told what to do. And I think having people that are really active members, even if there's a hierarchy, I think that's really important. And often it's just because they have never had the opportunity to be asked what their opinion is, and to be valued.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Chris, that it's about empowerment and active musicianship. I have found that being sensitive to my role, that with certain things, I actually have to ask opinions all the time, and opinions may vary. But in the end, because working with musicians of really high caliber, so it's very telling very quickly what works and what does not work. But it's more important to hear the voices of those who would not have been vocal about something. And I find that as a way for empowerment, and it completely enriches the music making approach.
Very much so.
What I'm hearing is very encouraging, and it's to be very thoughtful and to make it part of your musical approach, to have that ongoing conversation and creating those spaces. And as you said, Christopher, in the past 18 months, it has been transformative for you to have those small moments in the beginning of a session or afterwards, because in a sense, it prevents unnecessary buildup of tension. And it also then takes care of small moments of tension that could have become bigger. So it just takes out those bigger tensions that could have been prevented. And in the end, it's not only then about the music, but this enables the music, it sounds, to become even better. Guys, we only have an hour and we have like 5 minutes left. Like all good shows, this is nearing to the end too soon. So I'm going to offer each of you 1 minute just to round up what you are taking from this conversation, something that you maybe heard that you want to embrace or rethink a little bit and make part of your approach going forward. Judge Yacoob, I'm going to ask you again to start.
For me, the important thing was to get people to hear how you hear it. The importance of that is not that they hear it as you hear it, but they begin to understand that different people hear it differently. So they know that somebody standing at a different portion of the audience will be hearing it differently, that everyone's experience is different, and that has got to work itself through. One of the things I wanted to add, though, is that the conversation should not always be around music, because music is not only what a human being is all about. And if I bring it to law, then if the conversations between judges are only about law, you don't really understand each other properly. You don't really work out where the person comes from, where the trouble lies, and so on. And I was wondering how important it is sometimes to facilitate discussion and conversation in a social setting, sometimes about things that have nothing to do with music, sometimes because people are interested in talking about it, so that you get to know the person better, because there's a relationship between the person as a person and the person playing the music. So that's the second thing which I learned today, which is that you cannot limit it to the area of activity. And finally, I want to say that somehow, if I could link in those days, and I wasn't able to do so, my legal experiences with the musical experience, it might have helped me a great deal. And therefore, finally, it may be very interesting for people in music to go outside their own fields to talk about conflict in labor, conflict between people, conflict between married people, etc., etc. So if you can start talking about conflicts between other people in different areas, in different regions of different things, then you're not talking about the people themselves, and people are learning and beginning to understand other things and not about yourself. I think that's all I want to say.
Okay.
Thanks very much for that. Samson, your takeout from the session.
I was inclined to agree with the judge then, until I realized that in my very narrow world, things are almost, well, I suppose then quite narrow. I was just thinking about the string quartet that, they make amazing music together. But when they travel, they in the UK, they travel on 4 separate compartments of the train. And they also, when they can, wish that they could stay on 4 different hotels. And yet, when they come on stage, they are unified in a sense, because they are making music. And I think I delve in, always relish tension if it's going to yield results that will transform the music making process in my experience. There's this joke that if you play a wrong note timidly, then it's a wrong note. But if you play a wrong note with authority, then it's interpretation. And there is something that I have learned also this evening, just reflecting on this discussion, that when making music with other people, and I again, it's about taking things for granted, but it's a tool for an expression, which is innately a human endeavor, and to have that tool that you use to express yourself, in a sense, is a privilege. And when you have that space where you are able to express yourself with other people, we find ourselves that we are already feeling that we're expressing something so innately vulnerable that at any point, the growth is that you are always touching on something that is innately vulnerable. And I always understand how it can be difficult to avoid conflict, simply because it is something that people feel so innately and passionate about and care about. And as I mentioned earlier, that it's not even a financial endeavor. And as a result, people want some ownership to it and want to be heard.
Thanks very much, Samson. Christopher.
Well, thank you for what my esteemed colleagues have said already. I'd like to echo that and also touch on that we're talking about people and human interactions. And so I think having an idea of what end result you would like that relationship to have is important before going into any conflict. I think if the outcome is not what can I seek to gain from this, but what can we achieve together, I think that makes a large difference in terms of how the negotiations might happen. And so I think a big part of it for me is to have that ability to take half a step back and just think, ultimately, is this a battle that I need to pick? Can I eat some humble pie? Can we agree to disagree? Because at the very end of the day, we have these human relationships that are more important than whether or not we take a larger breath or go through that phrase, and I think we have to remember those human interactions. Unlike a string quartet, we always stay in the same hotel, although I like the fact that we sit on different parts of the plane as well. But I think it's important to me that this is not just about being on stage and playing some dots and trying to be musical. It's about what you can achieve together. And ultimately, it's not even about what we're doing on stage. It's there is an audience. We are trying to be entertainers. It's not just about us having a really wonderful time on stage. Watch us and how much fun we're having. It's how can we, interact with you, and what experience do you want the audience to have as they walk away, walk home. And once we start thinking of others rather than ourselves, I think we probably achieve greater things. And so that's a big thing for me, that we are unified in our pursuit of what we can achieve together, rather than an individual pursuit of what we can achieve by ourselves. And that's a big thing for me, both in performing and in negotiating conflict, which, as the judge said, is very necessary because it exists in life. So there's no point shying away from it, but we can certainly be respectful in how we enter those discussions, as lively as they might become, and how we exit them and find some sort of resolution.
Thanks very much, guys, for all of your contributions and your valuable insights. And I think the big takeaway is that regardless of the specific situation in an ensemble, or an orchestra, or a career somebody's struggling with, if they can take these approaches you guys have and apply it to that specific, whether it's somebody showing up late to practices, or having differences in terms of approach or the musical direction, that if you can do these things right, those small specifics should be okay. And as Chris said now at the end, to enter, but to also exit. And the judge also said that earlier, to make sure that there's an end to the tension and an end to the conflict, but not to shy away from that. I think we must tell Sophia we should have a follow-up sometime, because the hour just went past so so quickly, but I learned a lot from this as well.
And thank you very much. We haven't thanked you.
Yes.
You have been
thank you very,
very
much.
good for us.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks very
fantastic.
much. I appreciate. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm sure this will be